I thought it was just a random NPC. That's what my player said when we were chatting after we were done with the adventure. Random NPC? There's no such thing, or at least there should not be. What could you do to never let your D&D players get distracted on your game table again? I started to always consider this question. What is the role of this social encounter for the adventure? As I stopped talking, each of my players immediately took turns explaining what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it. Not 1 second of silence or hesitation. Quite the Dungeon Master's dream, isn't it? Hello and welcome to the Deep Dice Press. We are a bunch of friends on the 30s who have played D&D since our teen years and who love role-playing and storytelling. In a given day, it just so happened that we were all going through career transitions and thought, why not give a shot on developing D&D products? And that's how our indie D&D publisher was born, small in size, but big in aspirations. Our purpose is to take our D&D adventures to the magical excitement and deep immersion we experience with the epic tales and narratives of humankind. If you find this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the bell to receive notifications of new videos with similar content. You can also find the links for our social media on the description down below. Mastering D&D social encounters is no easy task, especially if your group is inclined towards role-playing and storytelling. Social encounters are the moment where all stories of a campaign are actually unveiled. They're the moment where the campaign and the adventure plot build up, where the lore of your world is shared with the players and where the player character's arc develop. Social encounters are that much important, but they can only work as much as players are engaged and connected with your game session. Hence the question, what to do to never let your D&D players get distracted on your table again? Certainly, there are many answers to this question, but what I'd like to share are the 2 things I did to engage my D&D players in our social encounters. 1. Don't leave your D&D players in the dark with NPCs. Make sure you have clear encounter roles so that you don't let your D&D players skim past important NPCs. 2. Make sure your D&D players know what to look for in social encounters. You should never create random NPCs in your D&D adventure. Every social encounter should have a clear connection with your story. We know not always that will be possible, but what we strive for is that you never have 1 second of hesitation from your D&D players. With that in mind, I'll also share a practical example of how I apply those approaches in my adventures. So join us, won't you? What could you do to never let your D&D players get distracted on your game table again? For sure, there are many answers to this question, but I have a couple of storytelling techniques that I apply when I'm building social encounters that I find very useful for engaging players. The first one of them is creating clear encounter roles. And the second one is creating clear encounter connections with the story, both with previous and future events in the adventure or campaign. Clear encounter roles and connections to the story lead to player engagement and immersion and make them more naturally inclined to take action, avoiding distraction. So let's talk a bit about that. It's not uncommon that me and my D&D players hang around after our game sessions having a beer and chatting about what they've just been through. Not long ago, they skimmed past an NPC who had important information about the adventure. We were having a laugh on how much easier it would have been for them if they had approached that NPC in a more effective way. One of the players admitted they were not paying that much attention on that moment of the session and that they had let it slip. That night, I caught myself wondering what I could do to prevent my D&D players from getting distracted in important situations. And I actually got a relevant insight to improve my approach on social encounters building. I started to always consider this question. What is the role of this social encounter for the adventure? My guess was that if I myself had a clear answer for that question, my players would more easily understand what they could take away from it and better tune in when to dig deeper and when to move on. I developed a simple framework considering that my social encounters may have one or more of three possible roles. Role number 1, uncover new information for the players. By that, I mean that a social encounter may open a new topic or a new subplot that has not appeared on the campaign so far. Role number 2, highlight known information. I find this one super important. There's so much going on in a D&D campaign that you cannot rely that the players will be able to remember and put together all important information. We learn a lot through repetition. I make sure that every important topic of the campaign is mentioned by NPCs more than once. With that, I make clear for the players that they're dealing with an important piece of knowledge and they should take note of. Number 3, develop known information. Suspense and surprise are important elements of storytelling. An effective way of building up tension and creating plot twists is splitting up information and spreading those pieces of knowledge across several encounters, up to the point where they are finally resolved. This is, of course, a very important role I use my social encounters for. In practice, when I'm creating my adventures, this approach may go one of two ways. The first one is clearer. I have some information about the adventure, the campaign, the world, or about the player characters themselves that I want to communicate to the players, so I build an encounter that will allow me to fulfill this role. On the second approach, I'm not thinking of that when I'm building the encounter. The story itself calls for a certain encounter, so I build it. But as soon as I'm done, I stop myself and think, what is this encounter role, and is it really clear for the players? It's actually much interesting how many times asking myself this simple question made me go back to adjust the encounter with great improvements. When I make sure that an encounter role is clear for me, and I put myself in the shoes of the players and I can see how they're gonna figure out what that role is, that's when I know that I'm not leaving my players in the dark with NPCs. That improves the adventure flow, better engaging my players in our social encounters. I thought it was just a random NPC. That's what my players said when we were chatting after we were done with the adventure. Random NPC? There's no such thing, or at least there should not be. But that got me thinking why my players would consider that I would include an NPC if not to help to move the story forward, or why a Dungeon Master would ever do that. I started playing D&D in its second edition, when I was a teenager. When I graduated and moved to another city, my D&D buddies were gone and that came to a halt. It was only years later that I would start playing again, but then I was playing as an adult, and with maturity comes a whole other approach to writing D&D adventures. I was initially too concerned with making social encounters feel real. In real life, some of our conversations prove useful, and some of them are just small talk or pointless information. I wanted my players to put some effort to find the right person and the right clue in my encounters. But that would be real life and not D&D. It was actually naive of me to try to bring that to my D&D adventures. It only made them boring. That's the advantage of movies, right? We can edit out the boring parts out of it. On the other hand, it wouldn't feel real or make sense to me that every interaction would bring relevant information for the player's current quest. How could I solve that? Well, a social encounter role is to convey a given information. If there's no information to share, there's no reason for an NPC to be there. It's not a problem that an NPC has a very small connection to the adventure, as long as it's clear for the players what connection that is. So I consider different possible social encounter connections when I'm building an interaction with an NPC. Any encounter of mine may have one or more of those 4 possible connections. First, to the adventure. Most often, the information shared by an NPC is connected to the quest the players are currently pursuing. 2. Campaign plots. Of course, there is overarching knowledge about the campaign that spans across several adventures. A social encounter may be connected to those overarching themes rather than the immediate adventure. 3. Campaign world. Social encounters are an effective way of sharing lore about the campaign world. I find doing it this way much more interesting than sharing this knowledge through fact sheets or metagame information dumps. 4. Characters' story arcs. Characters' backstories should be a starting point and not an end on itself. I love to connect social encounters with characters' backstories, helping to support the development of a character's story arc. In fact, that's so important to me that we'll release an entire video on that subject in the near future. But those 4 elements are the framework I keep in mind when I'm building a social encounter. I want to have clear in my mind what's its connection to the adventure, the campaign, the world, and the player characters. When I tie those elements to a social encounter, it immediately comes alive. It brings to the player the excitement that both the world and the story are larger than they might have initially seemed, and that they're making part of a great saga. It provides player immersion and makes them more naturally inclined to take action and uncover whichever new parts of the story are ahead of them. It's my secret weapon to get rid of player distraction in my D&D tables. The goal of those approaches is to never have 1 second of hesitation from your D&D players when they come into a social encounter. I think a practical example on how I usually apply those approaches could be handy, so let's talk about it. As you come into the farm feeling the weirdness of the journey, you are merrily greeted by a dwarf lady carrying a tray with hot soup and cold ale. Outside the dwarf family house, you can see a few travelers either dining on wooden tables or setting camp. A few purple dragon officers, a group of troubadours carrying the banner of the Chamber of Lords, and a lonely traveler, apparently wounded. What would you like to do? As I stopped talking, each of my players immediately took turns explaining what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it. Not 1 second of silence or hesitation. You could feel the excitement and curiosity on their voices. They were eager to talk to those people and uncover whichever wonders and perils they would have to reveal. Quite the Dungeon Master's dream, isn't it? Why were my players so engaged with this social encounter? It wasn't always like that. But when I learned to build my D&D social encounters with clear encounter connections and a clear encounter role, I saw my players' attitude change right in front of my eyes. In this particular encounter, the party was investigating a group of bandits who were making violent attacks on a trading route. They had just arrived at a farm that served as a resting camp for travelers. The party already had a clear encounter goal, which would help the players to take initiative. They knew they were supposed to talk to the travelers to search for information about the bandits. But let me show you how powerful the effect of adding on top of an encounter goal also encounter connections and roles that it brings to an encounter like that. The party was originally hired by the Purple Dragons, the military force of the Kingdom of Cormyr. They carried a mandate letter with the royal seal assigning them this mission. This adventure connection made it compelling for the party to engage on a social encounter with the Purple Dragons officers they saw. After all, the officers were part of an organization they trusted. Our fighter asked to approach them and quietly handed the mandate letter. With that, they immediately earned the officer's trust. The officers mentioned the injured traveler on the camp had been attacked by bandits and would have first-hand information about them. However, my main counter role here was to uncover new information connected to the campaign world. So the officers shared lore about the Stormhorns, which is the nearby mountain ridge that formed a natural protection against invaders on the northern border of the realm, and which would play an important role throughout our campaign. As for our rogue, she wanted to approach the lonely traveler. I mentioned that his trading cart was partially burnt and that he appeared to be wounded. There was, of course, another adventure connection to this social encounter, as the traveler was probably a victim of the bandits. But our rogue pondered the traveler could easily be a disguised informant to the bandits, lurking for their next targets. That made our rogue choose a dubious approach, in which she would overshare information about the party, telling the traveler they were transporting valuable goods and the exact location they would camp next. If the traveler were an informant, she would be throwing a bait for an attack the following night, and the party would be ready. If the traveler were truly a victim, our rogue wanted him to feel compelled to share as much detail as possible about the bandits. That was a lovely approach that showed me how much she was engaged with the adventure, carefully considering her actions and paying much attention to what could be going on. It turns out that the traveler had overheard the bandits saying who was the new bandit leader. The players already knew they had a new leader, but didn't know who he was. This encounter developed and resolved unknown information connected to the adventure. When something like that is revealed, the players immediately understand that it was the main encounter role. That gives them a clear sign that they have succeeded on their encounter goal and may now move on, knowing they're not leaving anything important behind. Finally, our paladin asked to approach the group of troubadours. As the royal knight he was, he expected them to immediately recognize him as a lord and his order as a trusting one. He would share that he had been asked to escort some merchants and ask about the bandits and for news from the royal court. What made our paladin want to approach this group was the fact that they were carrying the banner of the Chamber of Lords. That was an important encounter connection to our campaign plot. There was an ongoing dispute between the Chamber of Lords and the Court Royal, which our paladin was aware of. While the troubadours had no relevant knowledge on the bandits, they shared detailed information about the ongoing political dispute. This encounter role, after all, was to highlight known information connected to the campaign plot. In other words, this encounter was not built to move the adventure forward. Not every encounter needs to do that, after all. Rather, it was placed there to make sure the players would keep on top of their minds important information connected to the overarching campaign. A social encounter is basically a means to convey information, and it helps me a lot to think what I'm trying to communicate with it. In other words, what's its role? Is it to uncover new information, to highlight known information, or to develop known information? Encounters also don't always need to be connected to the adventure itself. I think it's important that some social encounters are better connected to the campaign world or plot. Such connections with different story layers create player immersion and makes the characters' actions as natural as possible because they make the world and the story feel real for them. This approach is, for me, the most effective way to engage my D&D players in social encounters. We talked about a lot of things, so let's try to wrap it up. Is there anything you can do to never let your D&D players get distracted on your table again? We're trying to answer this question considering social encounters, as their pace depends a lot on the player's engagement. In my experience, social encounters many times don't go as well as they could simply because of a lack of engagement and connection of my players with the story. When my players are not able to see how a particular encounter is related to previous or future events in the adventure or campaign, it's much easier for them to pay less attention and get distracted in important moments of the adventure. Considering that, there were two things I did to engage my players in our D&D adventures and make sure they would be more immersed and therefore more naturally inclined to take action. The first one was setting clear encounter roles. The second thing I did was setting clear encounter connections with the story. I see social encounters basically as means to convey information, and that's why it helps me a lot to think what I'm trying to communicate with them. In other words, what's the encounter role? Do I want it to uncover new information, to highlight known information, or to develop known information for the players? Once I have a clear answer for that, I can think how the encounter connects with previous and future events of the story. Of course, the most obvious connection for a social encounter is the adventure itself, but I'm also always trying to build connections with the campaign plots, the campaign world, and the characters' story arcs. When I started to tie all those elements into my social encounters, I saw them coming much more alive. They provide player immersion and make them curious and excited to engage with the story, making their action in our fictitious world much more natural. When I'm building my D&D adventures, I try to keep in mind I'm both creating a cool story and designing a game. From a storytelling viewpoint, it's very important to make sure my social encounters have clear roles and clear connections not only with the adventure, but with our entire campaign. Those elements help to make each scene, each encounter of the adventure more interesting to my players. That's what I do to increase their engagement and connection with our D&D adventures, and that's what helped me to get rid of player distraction in my D&D table. What do you think? Sounds like something that could also work for your social encounters? If you're interested in the content of this video and would like to know more about it, click on the link in the description below to download for free our booklet, Make Your Character Matter. You can also find more related content in our social networks. All links are available in the description below. If you want to check out a module where we apply all concepts discussed in this channel, look out for a new campaign, The Kingdom of Cormyr, One Purple Raven, available this winter. Clicking on the screen, you may find more videos on how to create exciting D&D adventures and characters, why your D&D players are too quiet on your game sessions, and what I did to deliver high-energy D&D sessions and avoid boring games. Our next video in this series is Do What Stranger Things Did and Write Better D&D Adventures. If you think it might be interesting for you, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell to receive notifications for new content. This video makes part of our series on how to create great D&D campaigns. In this series, we discuss what we believe to be the core elements of an outstanding D&D campaign for players who enjoy role-playing and storytelling, great characters and great stories. In the Great Characters videos, we talk about the importance of backstories, allies, bringing the party together, and how to connect all of that into an outstanding D&D campaign. In the Great Stories videos, we discuss topics such as building up tension and suspense, plot lines, plot twists, villains and patrons, as well as advanced storytelling techniques. And yet, the best way to create great adventures is getting inspiration from great ideas. So be sure to share your great ideas and experiences in the comments down below. What do you do to avoid players from getting distracted on your D&D table? I'm sure your experience will inspire not only us, but many others. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. We are the Deep Dice Press.